Thanks for watching. If you enjoy forgotten World War II POW stories, please like and subscribe to help us share more survival tales. Today, we explore Flight Lieutenant Frankie Grimson's story. An RAF Spitfire pilot, Grimson learned his mind could be a weapon against Nazi captivity. When Colditz Castle seemed impenetrable, he used psychological warfare, weaponizing insanity itself against his Wehrmacht captors. This is his story. March 1941, 14,000 feet over Berlin. Frankie. Grimson felt his Spitfire shake as German flak tore through the wing. Metal shrieked, the plane pitched, and oil blinded him. The right engine died. With seconds left, Grimson ejected into the freezing air, his parachute deploying with a violent jerk. Below, the city burned. Above, German fighters circled. He knew his fate on Nazi soil. Wehrmacht soldiers captured him in a Berlin suburb. Rifles aimed, Grimson raised his hands as German voices barked orders. A rifle butt struck his ribs for moving too slowly. They dragged him into a truck with 3 other downed RAF crew. Their silent, knowing eyes reflected tales of captured Allied airmen. The truck rumbled through the devastated city, past skeletal buildings and civilians who spat at them. First, Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe interrogation centre. 3 days in a narrow concrete cell. Interrogators asked about squadrons, targets, and aircraft. Grimson only gave his name, rank, and service number, earning him 24 hours in a freezing punishment cell. When processed for transfer, a Luftwaffe officer reviewed his file, his expression hardening. He made a quick call, then stamped the file. Auflag 4C Colditz. You will not escape from there, Flight Lieutenant. Grimson knew Colditz. It was the Nazi fortress for Deutschfeindlich prisoners, men who had embarrassed the Wehrmacht too often. Grimson's 3 prior escape attempts from Stalag Luft 1 had earned him this transfer. The Wehrmacht didn't execute such escapers. They buried them alive in medieval stone. The 2-day train journey to Saxony was in a cattle car with 30 British and Polish officers. Wehrmacht guards, machine guns on their laps, sat at each end. The prisoners shared space with lice in their own waste, escape a forgotten thought. Through the wooden slats, Grimson saw untouched spring fields, villages and children waving, an obscene normalcy. May 1941. At a small Saxony station, SS guards replaced the Wehrmacht, harsher, quicker with their rifle butts. They marched the prisoners through medieval Colditz, up a winding cobblestone street towards the cliff. Then he saw it. The castle, a 7-story grey stone tooth erupting from the rock, towering over the Mulde River. Ancient, 3-foot-thick walls, barred, narrow windows, guard towers with sweeping searchlights, red Nazi flags with swastikas. The fortress had stood for 1,000 years. It would stand 1,000 more. The outer courtyard gate opened. Wehrmacht guards counted them through. 47 officers from 6 allied nations, British, French, Polish, Dutch, all troublemakers, all failures. The inner courtyard was a killing box, overlooked by windows on all sides. Guards with German shepherds patrolled. Double barbed wire lined the walls. Grimson noted the lack of blind spots. Every inch was visible. Processing in a damp, ancient stone room began. A Wehrmacht Hauptmann with Iron Cross ribbons reviewed each file. Reaching Grimson's, his mouth tightened. Flight Lieutenant Grimson, 3 escape attempts, tunnel, wire cutting, impersonating a German guard. He looked up. Colditz is different from Stalag Luft 1. Here, we shoot escapers on sight. Understood? Grimson met his gaze, silent. Strip. Completely. They searched every seam, confiscated his watch, RAF wings, and a photo of his sister. He received worn French trousers, a Belgian tunic and mismatched British boots. The Wehrmacht deliberately mixed nationalities in their clothing, making disguises harder. Grimson filed this detail. British Army Captain Pat Reed, his eyes bearing the distant stare of long captivity, collected him. Welcome to Colditz, Flight Lieutenant. I'm the escape officer for the British. 43 attempts in 8 months, 0 successes. The castle's impregnable. They climbed stone stairs to the British quarters on the 3rd floor. The corridor reeked of unwashed bodies and boiled cabbage. Grimson saw the barred windows overlooking sheer drops, solid oak doors locked at night. Reed opened a 20-foot square room. 12 men lived there, on triple-tier bunks, with a small stove and a single naked bulb. The men looked up, hollow eyes, emaciated frames, uniforms hanging loose. One stared at the wall, another compulsively counted stones, a third whispered to himself. Reed saw Grimson's expression. "Colditz breaks men," Reed said quietly. "Physically we survive. Mentally," he gestured. "This is what happens when escape is impossible. Men retreat. The Wehrmacht knows it. They don't need cruelty here. The castle does the work." That first night, Grimson lay in his bunk listening to captivity. Hourly guard changes shouted German commands, boots on stone, barking dogs, searchlights sweeping across barred windows. Somewhere a man screamed. The officer above him wept silently. Grimson understood Colditz immediately. It wasn't just a prison. It was a psychological weapon. It crushed spirits. Every public escape failure reinforced. Resistance is futile. Guards didn't brutalize prisoners when hopelessness worked better. Morning appel was at 0600. 400 Allied officers stood in the courtyard for roll call. German NCOs counted and recounted, deliberately slow, for over an hour in the cold drizzle. Grimson studied the guards. Older Wehrmacht, disciplined, professional, not sadistic. The castle itself was the punishment. After appel, the daily routine began. Ersatz coffee and sawdust like black bread. Red Cross parcels, sporadic, provided the only real nutrition. Tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes. Grimson learned a man would starve without them. Guards arbitrarily delayed parcels, a small, cost-free cruelty. Days were killing in their emptiness. No work, no duties. Just crushing boredom, broken by 2 daily appels. Men played cards, read worn books, walked circles in the courtyard, learned languages. Anything to fill the void. Grimson watched men deteriorate, not from brutality, but from meaninglessness. The Wehrmacht had perfected a different torture. His first week was spent studying defences. The main gate had 3 identity checkpoints. Outer walls dropped 70 feet. Unclimbable. Windows were too narrow. Even if bars were removed. Guards patrolled, no blind spots. The isolated castle on its rock was surrounded by Colditz town, every civilian a potential informant. Even escaping the fortress meant 500 miles in Nazi Germany to the Swiss border. Reed was right. The castle was impregnable by conventional means. But Grimson noticed something else. How guards treated broken prisoners. They relaxed around those who'd given up, searching and watching them less. Mentally shattered prisoners were no threat as good as dead. Guard discipline focused on men like Reed, those with defiance. The Wehrmacht read body language, eye contact, posture, instinctively identifying dangerous prisoners. The reverse, then, must be true. If Grimson could convince them he had broken, truly shattered, he might become invisible. Not worth watching. The idea solidified during appel. A Polish officer screamed, charged the barbed wire, and was dragged to the cooler. Other prisoners watched with dead eyes. Another man snapped. Guards processed it routinely. Grimson later learned the Pole had done it deliberately, earning a week's punishment to settle a gambling debt. The insanity was an act. That night, Grimson calculated, a tunnel would take months, dozens of men. Impossible to hide in Colditz. A wire rush meant bullets. A disguise required materials they lacked. But psychological warfare, convincing the Wehrmacht of his mental collapse, needed only commitment. Selling the performance completely might lead to transfer to a hospital or psychiatric facility outside the castle, places with fewer defences, places a sane man could escape. The risk was immense. If the Wehrmacht saw through the act, he'd be in the cooler indefinitely. Worse, too thorough a performance, living in the insanity too long, could blur the line between acting and reality. He'd seen it happen. Yet, watching officers waste away, Grimson knew his advantage. He was naturally theatrical, a charmer since childhood. And he possessed a quality the Wehrmacht couldn't predict. He was just mad enough to convince them he'd gone completely insane. That night, Grimson began planning his performance. Not the escape yet. That would come later, outside Colditz. First, he needed the Nazi guards to believe Flight Lieutenant Frank Grimson had finally, irreversibly, broken. The breaking point. On June 19th, 1942, during morning roll call at Colditz Castle, Flight Lieutenant Frank Grimson collapsed, convulsing on the courtyard stones. Wehrmacht guards. caught off guard by this unexpected event, remained frozen. For 3 weeks, Grimson had meticulously crafted this performance, but this morning's display, violent tremors, soap-induced foam, and eyes rolled back, convinced Hauptmann Reinhold Eggers, the Nazi security officer, that Grimson was truly psychotic. Fellow RAF prisoners, Squadron Leader Dick Howe and Flight Lieutenant Bill Fowler, rushed to Grimson's aid, shouting for medical assistance in German while shielding his face from excessive Nazi scrutiny. Oberstabsarzt Rahm, the Wehrmacht doctor, arrived swiftly, his medical bag trembling slightly as he knelt beside the thrashing British officer. Grimson had spent weeks observing Rahm, understanding the German physician's methodical nature and discomfort with anything unpredictable, and knowing that insanity would disrupt the Nazi medical system's rigid protocols. The decision to escalate this psychological operation had solidified 5 days prior. Grimson witnessed 2 Polish officers dragged to the cooler for attempting a wire escape. From his cell window he saw the Gestapo arrive in black Mercedes from Leipzig, their leather coats disappearing into the commandant's office. Hours later the Poles reappeared, their faces swollen, returned to their cells without trial. Grimson realized that a physical escape from Colditz's 700-year-old fortress, with its guard towers, searchlights, barbed wire, and 300 miles to neutral Switzerland, was nearly impossible. Colditz, designated a Sonderlager for persistent escapers, was considered escape-proof by Wehrmacht High Command. However, a psychological escape, rendering himself such an unbearable nuisance that Nazi administrators would transfer him to a less secure psychiatric facility, presented a genuine possibility. This meticulously planned operation required coordination with 5 British officers. Captain Pat Reed, the senior British escape officer, initially opposed the plan, fearing it would divert resources from the Harry Tunnel being dug beneath the chapel. But Grimson persisted during their clandestine meetings in the recreation yard, discussing it in low tones under the pretense of talking cricket. The psychological operation demanded specific elements: a gradual behavioral deterioration, aligning with Wehrmacht medical understanding of psychosis, fellow prisoners corroborating his symptoms to Nazi guards without revealing collusion, and timing calibrated to Nazi administrative cycles for transfer decisions. Flight Lieutenant Dominic Bruce, renowned for previous escape attempts, provided crucial intelligence on Nazi mental health facilities, having feigned illness himself the previous year. Bruce explained that Wehrmacht psychiatric hospitals near Leipzig, operating under Luftwaffe medical authority, focused on treating combat-traumatized German personnel and had minimal security compared to Soflag 4C's formidable defences. Grimson's escape method required no forged papers, no tunnels, no wire cutters. He weaponized behaviour itself. Fellow officers supplied margarine from Red Cross parcels to grease his hair into unsettling patterns. Lieutenant Mike Sinclair provided the soap Grimson chewed to produce foam before convulsions. Captain Julius Green, a pre-war physician, coached Grimson on authentic psychotic symptoms, the blank effect, inappropriate emotional responses, and disorganized speech patterns recognizable to Nazi doctors. Green stressed that the performance had to convince and disturb, generating genuine Nazi concern about liability. If Grimson merely seemed troublesome, he would be isolated indefinitely. But if he appeared dangerously insane, a threat to himself and others, Nazi military bureaucracy would demand a medical transfer. The execution commenced subtly in late May 1942. Grimson stopped shaving, allowing his RAF moustache to grow wild, a blatant disregard for military grooming standards enforced rigorously at Appel. During roll call he muttered, counting in German but interspersing nonsense words, confusing guards trying to verify prisoner numbers. At mealtimes, he arranged his food into geometric patterns, refused to eat, then ravenously consumed everything while staring blankly. Hauptmann Eggers initially dismissed these incidents as typical British defiance. However, Grimson's nocturnal rituals, standing at his cell window for hours, speaking to the courtyard stones, systematically tearing pages from books to fold into precise triangles, and laughing without provocation at 3 a.m., increasingly disturbed the Wehrmacht night watch. Other British officers amplified the performance through carefully orchestrated encounters. Squadron Leader Howe approached Nazi guards during exercise, expressing concern about Grimson's deteriorating mental state in fluent German. Flight Lieutenant Fowler reported to Hauptmann Eggers that Grimson had attacked him during chess, violently sweeping pieces from the board and shouting about invisible enemies. Each report contained specific, authentic details, building a consistent pattern that Nazi administrators could not ignore. Captain Reed ensured the escape committee coordinated these reports, spacing incidents across different guards and shifts, creating an impression of independent corroboration. Since the Wehrmacht documentation system required written reports of unusual prisoner behaviour, Grimson's file steadily accumulated the necessary paper trail for a medical transfer. The morning courtyard convulsion marked a critical acceleration. Oberstabsarzt Rahm ordered Grimson moved to the castle infirmary, a converted chamber in the medieval keep with barred windows and a single Wehrmacht medical orderly. Grimson maintained his character during the examination, letting the Nazi doctor test his reflexes while periodically attempting to bite his own hand. Rahm's clinical notes, preserved in Colditz records, described a severe psychotic episode, possibly schizophrenic break, patient non-responsive to verbal commands, exhibiting self-harm behaviours and complete dissociation from reality. The German physician recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation by specialists at a Wehrmacht hospital in Leipzig. However, Nazi bureaucracy moved slowly. The transfer request needed approval from Wehrmacht District Command, Gestapo security verification that the prisoner posed no escape risk, and coordination with Luftwaffe Medical Authority for psychiatric facilities. While paperwork navigated Nazi administrative channels, Grimson remained in the Colditz infirmary for 6 days, intensifying his performance. He refused all food, forcing Wehrmacht orderlies to attempt force-feeding as he thrashed and spat. He smeared excrement on his cell walls, a repulsive act that even hardened Nazi guards hesitated to confront. He conversed with hallucinated figures, calling them by name and responding to unheard questions, weaving elaborate paranoid narratives about poisoned water and Nazi assassination plots. The Wehrmacht medical orderly, an untrained conscript from Bavaria, reported to Rahm that Grimson had become unmanageable and potentially dangerous. The Nazi doctor observed daily from the doorway, growing increasingly uncomfortable, never definitively knowing if this RAF officer had genuinely lost his mind or was executing an elaborate deception. On June 25, 1942, Gestapo Inspector Hans Pippig arrived from Leipzig to evaluate the transfer request. Grimson had anticipated this scrutiny, aware of the Gestapo's superior psychological insight. Pippig, a career security officer skilled in detecting prisoner deception, entered the infirmary cell alone, dismissing the orderly. He sat on a wooden chair while Grimson crouched in a corner, rocking rhythmically. The Gestapo inspector spoke in English, then German, attempting to provoke a response. Grimson maintained his vacant stare, occasionally flinching at sounds only he perceived. Pippig offered a cigarette, a test of whether Grimson would break character for comfort. Instead, Grimson seized the entire pack, stuffing cigarettes into his mouth unlit, chewing tobacco and paper while maintaining eye contact that seemed to look through the Nazi inspector. The Gestapo evaluation lasted 40 minutes. Pippig questioned Grimson about his RAF squadron, aircraft type, and capture circumstances, questions designed to elicit an authentic military response. Grimson replied with non sequiturs, randomly mixing English and German, occasionally screaming about fire and falling. He urinated in the corner as Pippig watched, an act of such complete social disintegration that the Gestapo inspector abruptly stood and left. His report to Wehrmacht District Command, preserved in Nazi archives, concluded that Flight Lieutenant Grimson posed no escape risk due to complete mental incapacity, recommending immediate transfer to a psychiatric facility and noting that continued detention at Colditz created unacceptable liability. The Nazi system, unable to process this through normal military discipline, opted for removal over management. The transfer authorization arrived on July 1st, 1942. Grimson would be transported under Wehrmacht Guard to Reserve Lazarett Leipzig, a military psychiatric hospital 40 kilometers from Colditz. This facility treated German soldiers with combat neurosis, staffed by Luftwaffe medical personnel with minimal security. Unlike Colditz's medieval walls, the Leipzig hospital occupied converted apartment buildings near the city centre, relying on patient incapacity rather than physical barriers. Grimson had studied intelligence on Leipzig facilities, knowing that within the Nazi medical system, escape opportunities multiplied. Psychiatric patients received less supervision than POWs, doctors prioritised treatment over security, and the hospital's proximity to Leipzig's industrial sector offered routes to underground networks assisting Allied escapers to Switzerland. Grimson's fellow British officers understood this represented his moment of greatest vulnerability. The transport from Colditz to Leipzig created a narrow window where Nazi guards might discover the deception, where close confinement in vehicles might break his performance, or where the Gestapo could demand additional evaluation. Squadron leader Howe arranged for Red Cross parcels to be sent to Grimson before departure, allowing a final exchange where Howe whispered encouragement while feigning comfort for a disturbed patient. Captain Reed ensured Grimson received coded messages embedded in seemingly innocuous letters from Britain, providing addresses of anti-Nazi contacts in Leipzig, though including safe houses operated by German resistance members. Flight Lieutenant Bruce provided maps of Leipzig drawn from memory, showing routes from the hospital to railway stations and highlighting areas with minimal Wehrmacht patrols. The transport departed Colditz at dawn on July 3, 1942. Grimson rode in the back of a Wehrmacht medical truck with Oberstabsarzt Rahm and 2 armed guards. He maintained his performance throughout the journey, moaning periodically and attempting to throw himself against the truck walls until restrained with leather straps. The Nazi guards spoke quietly in German, relieved to be rid of this disturbing prisoner, remarking that madness frightened them more than defiance. Rahm monitored Grimson's vital signs, administered a mild sedative, and documented every symptom for the Leipzig hospital staff. To escape through performance, not to escape through performance, not violence. Reserve Lazarette Leipzig appeared unremarkable. 3-story brick buildings behind an iron fence marked by Wehrmacht medical flags, but conspicuously lacking guard towers, searchlights, or concentric walls like Colditz. Grimson observed these details, his vacant expression masking sharp calculations. Nazi guards transferred him to hospital orderlies, who led him to a ward with 12 beds, large windows overlooking Leipzig streets, and locked yet unbarred doors. Other beds were occupied by German soldiers, men with 1,000-yard stares from the Eastern Front, trembling hands from artillery trauma, victims of genuine psychological wounds from total war. That afternoon, Luftwaffe psychiatrist Oberstarzt Heinrich Müller examined Grimson, reviewing Rahm's extensive documentation from Colditz. Müller proved more perceptive than previous Nazi doctors. He conducted the examination in English, testing Grimson's ability to maintain character during complex linguistic interactions. He asked Grimson to perform simple tasks, touch his nose, raise his right hand, count to 10, observing for any break in the psychotic presentation. Grimson complied erratically, sometimes following commands, sometimes ignoring them, creating the inconsistency characteristic of genuine schizophrenia. Müller's clinical notes described chronic paranoid psychosis, likely pre-existing condition exacerbated by combat stress and captivity, prognosis for recovery uncertain, recommend extended observation and treatment. The Nazi medical system, confronting what appeared to be authentic mental illness in an Allied prisoner, defaulted to protocols designed for German patients: hospitalization, medication, and minimal restraint. For 3 weeks, Grimson remained in the Leipzig ward, refining his performance while secretly surveying escape opportunities. The hospital routine allowed patients to walk corridors during daylight, smoke in a courtyard garden, and receive visitors from Leipzig community members, volunteering to assist mentally wounded soldiers. Nazi security assumed psychiatric patients posed no escape risk, believing their mental incapacity rendered them harmless. The Wehrmacht guards conducted periodic counts but maintained a minimal presence, focusing on preventing suicides rather than escapes. Grimson observed shift changes, medication distribution times, and moments when orderlies gathered in break rooms, leaving wards temporarily unsupervised. He noted that several German patients received weekend passes to visit Leipzig families. Hospital gates remained unlocked during visiting hours, and Luftwaffe medical staff prioritized treatment over custody. The closest call occurred on July 18, 1942, when Oberstarzt Müller conducted an unexpected examination with a Wehrmacht psychiatrist, visiting from Berlin, a specialist in malingering detection. This visiting doctor subjected Grimson to sophisticated tests designed to expose deception. He introduced unexpected loud noises to test startle response, used painful stimuli to gauge reaction patterns, and asked complex questions requiring sustained deceptive answers. Grimson maintained his character flawlessly for 2 hours, allowing genuine exhaustion to enhance his performance. Understanding that any break would mean immediate return to Colditz or worse, the visiting psychiatrist concluded Grimson showed deterioration consistent with chronic psychotic process, no evidence of conscious deception. Patient appears genuinely disconnected from reality. Meller concurred, noting that Grimson's symptoms had remained consistent for 6 weeks, and such sustained performance would require acting ability beyond a reasonable prisoner's capability. By late July, Wehrmacht administrators began discussing Grimson's long-term disposition, and as Nazi policy for mentally ill Allied prisoners remained unclear, caught between Geneva Convention requirements for medical treatment and security concerns. Gestapo reviewed Grimson's case weekly, assessing intelligence risks. The British officer maintained his facade perfectly, giving Nazi authorities no reason to suspect deception, creating such complete conviction of insanity that discussions shifted toward repatriation through neutral Sweden under medical exchange protocols. If Grimson's performance fully succeeded, the Nazi system itself would return him to Britain as a psychiatric casualty unfit for military service. However, Grimson's plan required acting before Nazi bureaucracy finalised that decision, before transfer papers moved him from Leipzig back to Colditz, or to a Swiss border crossing under heavy Wehrmacht guard. The psychological operation had created perfect escape conditions: placement in a minimally secure facility, Nazi conviction that he posed no flight risk, and a freedom of movement impossible within Colditz's medieval fortress. Fellow RAF prisoners had smuggled civilian clothes, forged identity papers identifying him as a mentally disabled German factory worker, and contacts with Leipzig anti-Nazi networks into Red Cross parcels. The moment approached for Grimson to transform from a convincingly insane patient into a clear-minded escaper, navigating 300 miles through Nazi Germany towards Swiss neutrality. September 1943. Swiss border guards at St. Margrethen discovered a dishevelled man, Frank Grimson, Royal Air Force flight lieutenant, stumbling through morning fog. Emaciated and muttering incoherently, he initially appeared mad. However, he soon revealed a carefully preserved RAF identity disc stating, "I've just walked out of Nazi Germany." He had traversed 400 kilometres of enemy territory in 17 days, achieving freedom his Colditz captors deemed impossible. Swiss guards found only worn civilian clothes, forged papers, and a compass crafted from stolen hospital materials. Grimson, weighing a mere 127 pounds, 52 pounds less than when his Wellington bomber was shot down over France in February 1941, trembled uncontrollably, a lasting effect of 18 months feigning insanity for Nazi doctors. He had indeed escaped the escape-proof castle by convincing his captors he had lost his mind, then navigated the Third Reich perfectly sane. The Swiss military intelligence debriefing lasted 4 days, where Grimson's account, particularly his mental illness deception at Colditz, astonished them. His escape involved meticulous planning. During his final months at Wehrmacht Psychiatric Hospital near Frankfurt, Grimson studied guard routines, memorized German rail schedules, and analysed topography from hospital windows. Supervised walks served as reconnaissance, and his feigned confusion secured longer excursions. On September 3, 1943, during an afternoon stroll, he accelerated his pace, ducked behind dense undergrowth and vanished. The orderlies, accustomed to his erratic movements, assumed he had merely wandered ahead. By the time an alarm was raised, Grimson was 3 kilometres away, moving south in stolen railway workers' clothes. His journey through Nazi Germany showcased tradecraft learned from fellow Colditz inmates. See, he travelled exclusively at dawn and dusk, avoiding checkpoints by using lesser-known roads. He twice hid in freight trains. Near Ulm, a civilian almost identified him, but Grimson's feigned confusion, a residue of his madman persona, convinced the suspicious German he was a harmless local simpleton. The irony was not lost on him. Pretending to be insane freed him from Colditz. Pretending to be mentally deficient protected him in Nazi territory. On September 17th, he reached Lake Constance. Unable to swim well due to years of malnutrition, he followed the shoreline east towards the Swiss frontier, traversing marshland and evading Gestapo patrols. 2 kilometres from freedom, German voices forced him to crawl through freezing marsh water for 40 minutes. Upon finally crossing into Switzerland at St. Margrethen, his legs gave out. Swiss guards found him collapsed and weeping, the first genuine emotion he had permitted himself in 20 months. Within 72 hours of his arrival, British military intelligence officers reached Switzerland. MI9, the clandestine organisation coordinating Allied POW escapes, debriefed Grimson extensively. His Colditz mental illness deception was classified. MI9 feared publicising it might alert Wehrmacht authorities, jeopardising other POWs attempting similar ruses. Internally, however, his escape became a masterclass in psychological resistance. He had weaponized his captors' assumptions, manipulated Nazi psychiatric evaluation protocols, and exploited German administrative eagerness to remove problems from high-security camps. His Military Cross citation, issued in October 1943, vaguely read, "For outstanding courage and determination in escaping from enemy captivity under exceptional circumstances." Only senior RAF intelligence officers knew exceptional circumstances, referred to his deliberate efforts to secure a diagnosis of severe mental breakdown while remaining perfectly sane. Grimson returned to Britain in November 1943 via diplomatic channels, one of the few Colditz escapers to reach home before the war's end. His physical state shocked RAF medical examiners. Besides extreme weight loss, he displayed symptoms now recognised as severe PTSD, hypervigilance, insomnia, and flashbacks to Luftwaffe interrogations. In 1943, RAF psychiatry lacked frameworks for combat trauma. He received 3 months medical leave and was then deemed fit for duty. Grimson, unusually for a decorated officer, requested a non-combat assignment. RAF Personnel Command understood that 2.5 years in Nazi captivity, coupled with 18 months of feigning madness, had taken a significant psychological toll. He was assigned to test pilot duties at the Royal Aircraft Establishment Farnborough. As a test pilot, Grimson found a purpose that resonated with his pre-war RAF career. He specialised in evaluating captured Luftwaffe aircraft, bringing a unique perspective forged during imprisonment, where he observed German aviation technology from his shot-down bomber and later from Colditz's windows. From 1944 to 1946, he test flew seized Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, and even a rare Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. Colleagues noted his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail, which they interpreted as professionalism. This precision was partly a lingering habit from Colditz, where 18 months of maintaining a facade meant any behavioural slip could expose his sanity and shatter his escape hopes, ingraining extreme caution. He flew with precision but little joy. The war had evidently taken something profound from him. Grimson married Dorothy, a WAF officer from RAF intelligence, in 1947. She was one of the few people he trusted with the details of his Colditz story. They had 2 children. He continued as an RAF test pilot until 1956, then transitioned to civilian aviation as a senior test pilot for Hawker Aircraft. Colleagues recalled him as brilliant yet distant, a man of absolute concentration whose laughter often seemed forced. He rarely attended RAF reunions, never joined Colditz survivor associations, and consistently declined interview requests. When the 1955 film The Colditz Story premiered, featuring various escapes, Grimson did not attend. His mental illness deception remained classified and thus unportrayed. He told Dorothy he had no interest in reliving those years. "I spent 18 months pretending to be mad in a Nazi castle. Why would I want to remember that?" Privately, however, he corresponded with several Colditz survivors who understood the profound impact of Nazi captivity. Flight Lieutenant Pat Reed, who escaped Colditz in 1942, exchanged letters with Grimson for decades. In a 1958 letter, Grimson wrote, "The performance never truly ends. I convinced Nazi doctors I was insane by acting outside myself. Now I sometimes wonder which version was real, the madman or the man pretending to be mad. So Colditz made liars of us all." The psychological complexity of sustained deception haunted him. He had proven the human mind could maintain 2 realities simultaneously, but at the cost of permanent uncertainty about his authentic self. In 1961, MRI-9 declassified portions of Grimson's escape, though full details remained secret until 1972. Historians studying Colditz subsequently sought interviews. Grimson granted one in 1963 to journalist and military historian Major Pat Reed. his former fellow prisoner who was then writing Colditz histories. This interview illuminated the calculated nature of his madness, specific behaviours designed to alarm Nazi psychiatrists, studied unpredictability, and a careful balance between concerning and dangerous. Reed's 1964 book. The latter days at Colditz included Grimson's story in a chapter titled The Psychology of Escape, presenting the mental illness route as brilliant while noting Grimson's reluctance to discuss it. He considers it, in retrospect, a necessary deception that nonetheless required becoming, temporarily, what he pretended to be. The military cross remained Grimson's sole decoration for the escape. Some historians contend he deserved the Victoria Cross, the highest British military honour, for the sustained courage required to maintain 18 months of feigned insanity under Nazi observation. Yet, VC criteria demanded battlefield valour, not psychological endurance in POW camps. MI9 officials who knew the full story considered recommending him for the George Cross, awarded for supreme civilian gallantry, as he but decided his RAF status and combat escape context were not fitting. The MC stood. Grimson never expressed disappointment, stating in his 1963 interview, "I got out, that's what mattered. The men who didn't make it, or who were shot trying, they're the ones who deserve remembrance." Grimson died in 1982 at age 67 from heart failure. Medical examiners noted chronic stress markers consistent with long-term trauma. His obituary in the Times mentioned his MC and test pilot career, but only briefly referenced his escape from Colditz Castle during World War II. In 1984, Dorothy donated his papers to the RAF Museum, including a private journal kept sporadically after the war. An entry from February 1971, 30 years after his Wellington shoot-down, read, "Had the dream again. I'm in Colditz courtyard, performing madness for the guards. But I've forgotten I'm sane. They're laughing because they know I've actually gone mad. I wake up uncertain which version is the dream." The journal revealed what he had kept hidden. The escape that saved his life had irrevocably fractured his identity. Today, Colditz Castle operates as a museum, attracting 60,000 visitors annually. Grimson's escape is represented in exhibits through photographs, documents, and explanatory panels. Museum director Dr. Jörg Maurer notes, Grimson's mental illness deception represents one of the most psychologically complex escapes in POW history. Most Colditz escapes involved tunnels, disguises, physical deception. Grimson's required becoming convincingly someone he wasn't, for 18 months under constant Nazi observation. The mental fortitude that demanded is difficult for modern visitors to comprehend. A display case features Grimson's forged German identity papers, the compass he carried to Switzerland, and his RAF uniform from his 1941 capture, physical artifacts of an escape achieved primarily through psychological warfare. His story profoundly influenced post-war military training. After World War II, the nascent SER, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, programs extensively studied Colditz escapes. Grimson's case became classified study material in psychological resistance training. SER instructors teach that captors make assumptions about prisoner mental states, creating exploitable vulnerabilities. Grimson proved a prisoner could weaponize his captors' psychiatric frameworks, turning Nazi evaluation systems into escape tools. Near modern CRE training includes modules on behavioral deception under sustained observation, directly stemming from analyses of Grimson's Colditz performance. Air Force survival instructors still reference his now declassified case when teaching advanced evasion psychology. The escape's legacy extends beyond military training. Psychologists studying extreme stress resilience examine Grimson's extraordinary ability to maintain dual mental states, performing insanity while preserving sanity, for 18 months. Dr. Robert Krell, a psychiatrist specializing in POW trauma, wrote in his 1995 analysis, Psychological Warfare in Captivity, that Grimson's case demonstrates both human adaptability's outer limits and its costs. He survived by fragmenting his identity, but that fragmentation persisted decades after liberation. His escape succeeded, just his psychological recovery remained incomplete. This observation underscores a truth often omitted from heroic escape narratives. Freedom from Nazi captivity did not guarantee freedom from its psychological aftermath. Grimson's children, both living, rarely speak publicly about their father. In a 2015 interview for the 70th anniversary of WWI's end, his son James said, "Father was gentle, loving, but fundamentally elsewhere. Even at family dinners, part of him remained absent. Mother told us he'd done extraordinary things during the war, but he never spoke of them to us. Only near the end, when ill, did he mention Colditz. He said, 'I escaped a Nazi castle by pretending to be mad. Perhaps I wasn't pretending well enough, or perhaps too well. I'm still not certain which.'" Why remember Frank Grimson's escape from Colditz? Not merely for outwitting Nazi guards or walking 400 kilometers through the Third Reich, though both were remarkable feats. We remember because his escape illuminates psychological resistance's power and its profound price. He proved the human mind could sustain elaborate deception under impossible pressure, transform enemy assumptions into weapons, and preserve sanity while performing madness. Yet, his story also reveals that such victories incur invisible costs, that surviving Nazi captivity involved more than physical liberation, and that some escapes continue internally for decades. In an era grappling with questions of POW treatment, psychological warfare, and human resilience under authoritarian control, Grimson's Colditz escape endures as both a case study and a warning. It demonstrates that totalitarian systems harbour inherent vulnerabilities. Their assumptions, bureaucracies, and rigid frameworks can be exploited by sufficiently determined individuals. However, it also testifies that resistance at such depth leaves permanent marks. Frank Grimson escaped Colditz Castle in 1943. Whether he ever fully escaped what Colditz compelled him to perform remains perhaps an unanswerable question, and that ambiguity is the story's final, most honest lesson.